I've never been the type to get scared easily. Being home alone was usually something I enjoyed. No distractions, no need to pretend I wasn't introverted. It was a Friday night, and my parents had left for the weekend to visit family. The house was mine for the next 2 days. At first, everything was normal. I spent the evening binge watching a new series on the couch, the glow of the TV being the only light in the room. The usual silence outside was comforting, except for the occasional gust of wind rustling the trees. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. By 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I switched off the TV, and the sudden darkness that followed was startling. It's funny how a familiar place, your own home, can feel foreign in the dark. I flicked on the hallway light and made my way upstairs. That's when I heard it. A noise, a faint sound, a whisper almost. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but there it was again, a soft murmur coming from the direction of the kitchen. I told myself it was the wind or maybe the house just settling. I stood there, still, waiting for another sound, but silence. I shook off the unease and climbed the stairs faster than I'd intended. Once inside my room, I shut the door and turned on the lamp by my bedside. Safe. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through messages, anything to calm my nerves. But the back of my mind lingered on that whisper. I hadn't imagined it. Had I? I decided I was being ridiculous. I'd slept alone in the house dozens of times. There was no reason for tonight to be any different. I put my phone down and tried to sleep, but just as my eyelids grew heavy, there it was again, the whisper, this time closer. I sat up abruptly. My mind raced with explanations, but none of them made sense. My eyes darted around the room, but everything looked the same. I leaned over and grabbed the baseball bat underneath my bed, a relic from my brief, failed attempt at sports. Holding it tight, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. I listened again, but the house had returned to its eerie quiet. I told myself it was nothing and laid back down, but just as I started to drift off again, the whisper came back. It was clearer now, almost as if it was right outside my bedroom door. I froze. The air in my room seemed to thicken, and my chest tightened with fear. Every fiber of my being told me not to move, but I had to know what it was. Slowly, I crept toward the door, bat still in hand. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I twisted it, opened the door just a crack, and peeked into the dark hallway. The hallway was empty. Just the faint glow of the streetlight from the window casting shadows on the walls. But the whisper had stopped. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. I closed the door, shaking off the fear, convincing myself it was all in my head. I turned back toward my bed, but just as I did, I noticed something strange. There was something in the reflection of my bedroom mirror that shouldn't have been there. A figure. Standing by the window, just behind me. I spun around, bat raised, ready to swing, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. I stared at it, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was tired, imagining things. Maybe. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it again. This time it wasn't behind me. It was inside the mirror. The whisper returned, clearer than ever, a cold breath against my ear. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the mirror. The figure stood there, motionless, a dark shadow with no face, no features, just darkness. And then in a voice, barely louder than a breath, it whispered the same words over and over again, chilling me to my core. Let me in. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and rushing down the stairs. I fumbled with the front door lock, desperate to escape the house. But just as I reached for the handle, the whisper came again, now from the living room. "Let me in." I turned slowly, and there, standing in the darkened corner of the room, was the same shadowy figure. It didn't move. It didn't chase me, but its presence was suffocating. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The house was silent again, but the air felt wrong, heavy, with something I couldn't explain. I stood there, gripping the doorknob, waiting, wondering if it would come back. I never heard the whisper again that night, but as I stepped outside, taking in the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already gotten in my house, and it wasn't leaving. I've always been a night owl. Staying up late is when I feel most at ease, while the rest of the world sleeps. My parents had gone out of town for a business trip, leaving me alone for the weekend. It wasn't the first time, and quite frankly, I enjoyed having the place to myself. No curfews, no rules, just me, my music, and the quiet house. That Friday night started out like any other. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through my phone with some crime documentary playing in the background. The kind of thing that makes your imagination run wild, but I didn't care. I wasn't easily scared, especially not in my own home. It was nearing 1 a.m., and I was considering heading to bed when I heard a knock at the front door. It was faint, but distinct. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I froze. Who would be knocking at this time of night? My mind immediately went to my neighbors, but it was too late for casual visits. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself not to overreact. It could be someone who needed help, or maybe it was just a prank. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something about that knock just didn't sit right with me. I walked to the front door, careful not to make any noise. The house was dark, the only light coming from the TV flickering in the living room. I peeked through the peephole, but the porch was empty. I stood there for a minute trying to listen for any other sounds, but the night was still. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. I started to wonder if I had imagined it, or maybe it was just some kid playing a prank. Either way, I decided to let it go and headed back towards the couch. Barely 5 minutes passed before it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the front door. This time I couldn't ignore it. My pulse quickened as I crept back toward the door, once again peeking through the peephole. Still nothing. The porch was empty, just the dim glow of the streetlight in the distance. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My rational mind was telling me that it was probably nothing, but something felt wrong. I debated calling someone, but who? My parents were hundreds of miles away, and I didn't want to bother the police over what might be a stupid prank. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I turned on every light in the house, as if that somehow would make me feel safer. I returned to the living room, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, but my nerves were shot. I sat there, gripping my phone, my eyes darting toward the front door every few seconds. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold. A creak. The unmistakable creak of the front door shifting, just slightly, but enough to know someone had touched it. I hadn't heard the knob turn, hadn't heard any more knocks, but someone was definitely outside. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick from the coffee table, and made my way toward the door. My hands were shaking as I approached it. I slowly reached for the doorknob, took a deep breath, and pulled it open. The porch was empty again. No sign of anyone. The street outside was still and deserted. The neighborhood felt silent. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, but there was no one there. I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But just as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door was ajar. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I stared at it, trying to understand how it could have possibly opened on its own. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I quickly stepped inside and locked the door behind me, bolting it for good measure. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to take any chances. I rushed upstairs, every light still on, and sat in my bed, my back against the headboard. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too quiet, too still. My mind replayed every sound, every knock. I was trying to convince myself that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was inside of my house. Then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a soft sigh, coming from just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, my body frozen with fear. Slowly, the handle began to turn. The door creaked open just a crack, and that's when I saw her. A woman, barely visible in the sliver of light. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me through the small gap in the door. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could react, the door swung fully open. I blinked, and she was gone. The hallway was empty, the house silent. My mind raced, my heart pounding as I rushed to the door, pulling it shut and locking it behind me. I stood there, back against the door, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but before I could press call, I heard it again. The knock. But this time it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside of my house. It was late, probably close to midnight. I was home alone for the weekend, as usual, when my parents went on their monthly vacations. I never really minded. In fact, I kind of liked the peace and quiet. No rules, no interruptions, just me and whatever movie I was watching that night. I was lounging on the couch halfway through a thriller when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of glass breaking. It wasn't loud, more like a muffled shatter, but in the stillness of the house, it was impossible to miss. I muted the TV and sat up, straining to listen. For a second, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the house. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction of my kitchen. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I didn't press it. What if it was nothing? What if I was overreacting? My mind raced, but deep down, I knew this wasn't nothing. Someone had broken in my house. I stood, careful not to make any noise, and crept toward the hallway. As I moved closer to the kitchen, I could hear the footsteps more clearly now. Someone was definitely in my house, moving around slowly, as if they were searching for something or someone. I peeked around the corner into the kitchen. My worst fear was confirmed. There was a man dressed in dark clothes rummaging through our drawers. He hadn't seen me yet, but he was close. Too close. He was tall, muscular, and from the way he moved, he seemed like he knew what he was doing. I needed to think fast. I couldn't stay hidden forever, and I was too far from the front door to make a run for it. I glanced back toward the living room and saw my phone sitting on the couch. Calling the cops now would alert him for sure. I took a deep breath and gripped the candle holder I had used as a weapon tighter. I wasn't the bravest person, but I wasn't about to let some intruder roam freely in my house. As quietly as I could, I backed up into the living room, trying to come up with a plan. Just then, I heard the man move toward the living room. He was coming in my direction. My mind raced, but there was no time to think. I ducked behind the couch, crouching low, holding my breath. The man stepped inside the living room, his heavy boots echoing against the hardwood floor. I could hear him breathing as he moved closer. I tightened my grip, bracing myself. He walked right past me, his back to the couch, and I knew this was my chance. Without thinking, I leapt up and swung the candle holder with all my strength, smashing it into the side of his head. The sound of the impact was sickening, but the man grunted in pain and stumbled sideways, clutching his head. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, spinning around to face me, his eyes wild with rage. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too terrified. But I raised the candle holder again, ready to swing if he came any closer. He lunged at me, but I managed to dodge it just in time, swinging the candle holder again once more down onto his arm. He howled in pain, but it didn't stop. He grabbed me by the wrist, twisting it painfully until I dropped the weapon. I cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. I kicked him in the shin as hard as I could, and for a split second, his grip loosened. That was all I needed. I broke free and ran, sprinting toward the kitchen. My phone was still on the couch, but there was no time to go back for it. My only thought was to get out of my house. I reached the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the counter, turning around just in time to see the man charging toward me. I held the knife up, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. The man hesitated for a moment, sizing me up. His lip was bleeding, and there was a nasty bruise forming on the side of his head, but he didn't seem ready to back down. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving. Then, without warning, he lunged at me again. I swung the knife wildly, slashing his arm. He let out a furious yell, but kept coming towards me. I knew I couldn't fight him off forever. I had to end this. Summoning all the strength I had left, I pushed past him and bolted to the front door. He was right behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding the floor, but I was faster. I threw open the door and ran outside, screaming for help. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. My neighbor's porch lights flicked on as I sprinted down the street, my heart racing. I kept running until I was sure I was safe, collapsing in the yard of the nearest house. It wasn't until I was outside, gasping for breath, that I realized I still had my phone in my pocket. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 and finally pressed the call button. As I gave the operator my address, I glanced back toward my house. The front door was wide open, but the man was gone, vanished into the night. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the intruder was long gone. They searched the house, found the broken window, and took my statement. They promised to patrol the area and assured me I'd be safe. But even after they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I had survived, but I knew I would never feel safe inside of my home ever again.